The late 80s and early 90s could arguably be called the heyday of movie tie-in games. The 8 and 16-bit generations of consoles saw hundreds of titles of varying quality attempt to cash in on a film's box office success. Console gaming's 4th generation, for example, might see variations of a licensed property on both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, and maybe a handheld version for Game Boy or Game Gear. 2 or 3 releases per movie at most, on average. Some films, however, are what you might call overrepresented in the video game space. And for a show like From Camera to Console, in which I attempt to highlight the forgotten and underloved of one of gaming's most notoriously substandard categories of titles, this makes it particularly difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff. But in this episode, that's exactly what I'm going to attempt to do. By taking a look at a film that gave birth to no fewer than 8 releases for consoles and computer systems. I'll briefly touch on each of the games before diving into my favorite of the bunch. So without further ado, let's jump right in to Batman Returns. On March 30th, 1939, one of the most iconic characters of all time debuted in the pages of Detective Comics issue 27. Created by artist Bob Kane and writer Bill Finger, the anti-hero took form as a brooding vigilante who swears vengeance against the criminals of his home in Gotham City after witnessing the brutal murder of his parents as a young boy. By day, the wealthy playboy Bruce Wayne tends to his successful company, but by night, he dons the image of a chiropteran, striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. He is known only as the Batman. The character began as a sort of antithesis to DC's most popular comic hero of the time, Superman. While the Man of Steel used his nigh limitless powers to pursue truth, justice, and the American way, Batman's mission was far more self-serving and a much darker take on similar ideas of extrajudicial justice. Early on, Batman would often maim or kill his enemies, and even used guns for a time before writers decided to give him a stricter moral code. Over the years, Batman veered further and further away from his pulpy crime story roots, falling in line with the lighthearted science fiction tales of his comic book contemporaries. The apex of this transformation coming in 1966 with the campy television adaptation of the character starring Adam West. This cartoonish version of the Caped Crusader came to define him for 20 years. And then came Frank Miller, a hungry young writer and artist who had worked his way up the ranks at Marvel to eventually take the reins of their floundering Daredevil series, injecting it with more mature themes that quickly saw the book climb the sales charts. Taking his signature gritty style to Marvel competitor DC, Miller reinvented the Batman character, returning him to his dark roots with the 4-part miniseries The Dark Knight Returns in 1986. The success of the comic, along with similarly adult-oriented stories like Alan Moore's Watchmen, which came out the same year, helped to reinvigorate the comic book industry and forever redefined what comics could be. But even before Miller's fresh take on the character, producer and comic book fan Michael Uslan had purchased the film rights from DC in 1979 with the intention of making, quote, the definitive, dark, serious version of Batman, the way Bob Kane and Bill Finger had envisioned him in 1939, a creature of the night stalking criminals in the shadows. After unsuccessfully pitching the idea to several writers, directors, and executives, Uslan wrote a script of his own to help sell the project. With the help of producers John Peters and Peter Guber, and in part due to the success of Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and Alan Moore's The Killing Joke in 1988, the Batman movie project finally found a home at Warner Brothers, who had seen success through the prior decade with their Superman films starring Christopher Reeve. Coming off his first 2 hits, Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice, director Tim Burton was tapped to helm the film. Academy Award winner Jack Nicholson would step into the role of Batman's arch-nemesis, the Joker, while the controversially cast Michael Keaton, known at the time for his work in comedies, would don the cowl as the Caped Crusader himself. The film hit theaters on June 23, 1989, telling the story of how Bruce Wayne takes up the identity of Batman after seeing his parents shot dead by mobster Jack Napier. Years later, Batman would be partially responsible for Napier falling into a vat of chemicals, drastically altering his appearance and mental state and transforming him into the Joker. Having somewhat poetically created each other, the movie culminates in what Tim Burton once called a duel of the freaks. Batman dominated the box office in the summer of 1989, breaking records and going on to claim the #1 spot in domestic earnings on the year. This unprecedented success all but guaranteed a sequel would be produced. But Burton wasn't necessarily interested in making another Batman movie. He once said that unless a sequel offers something new and exciting, it's a most dumbfounded idea. Burton went off to make Edward Scissorhands while Sam Hamm, one of the screenwriters on Batman, worked on developing a follow-up. His treatments would see the iconic villains of Penguin and Catwoman working together to find hidden treasure. Warner Brothers convinced Burton to return by giving him a huge amount of creative control, which allowed him to disregard Hamm's screenplay and find his own writer. The scribe that caught his attention was Daniel Waters, whose script for the 1989 film Heathers contained the dark and wry sense of humor Burton wanted to inject into his Batman follow-up. Keaton would return as Bruce Wayne, while the part of the Penguin was specifically written for Danny DeVito. Annette Bening was tapped to play Selina Kyle, aka Catwoman, but became pregnant right before shooting began and had to be recast. Despite some strong competition from actresses such as Sean Young and Susan Sarandon, the part eventually went to Michelle Pfeiffer. Christopher Walken was also cast as an original character for the movie, Max Schreck, a wealthy tycoon who teams up with the Penguin to take over Gotham City. Originally, the character was supposed to be Harvey Dent, played by Billy D. Williams in the first film. The sequel would see him acquire his signature deformity, setting him up to be the villain in future movies. Alas, this did not come to pass, and Tommy Lee Jones ultimately replaced Williams as Dent in 1995's Batman Forever. Production designer Anton Furst was unable to return after working on Burton's first foray into Gotham City, so Bo Welch filled his shoes, having just worked with Burton on Beetlejuice and Edward Scissorhands. This would prove to give the sequel a far more stylized look than its progenitor, putting it more in line with the heightened visuals the director would come to be known for. With the legendary Stan Winston in the visual effects department and Danny Elfman back to compose the score, Burton had a veritable dream team to see the movie through to completion. And despite being set during the holiday season, Batman Returns hit US theaters on June 19, 1992. The film opens with a prologue showing how the wealthy parents of a deformed baby boy dispose of the child in the sewer, setting up the story of how young Oswald Cobblepot would come to be raised by a family of penguins living underneath Gotham City's abandoned zoo. Decades later, millionaire businessman Max Schreck is blackmailed by Cobblepot, now going by the moniker Penguin, to help him return to the surface and reintegrate into society. Meanwhile, Schreck's assistant Selina Kyle discovers her boss's plan to build a power plant that will drain the public works of its energy, essentially putting Gotham under Schreck's control. Upon this revelation, Schreck pushes Kyle out of a high-rise window to the ground below. However, she survives the fall, but is somehow changed. She takes up the mantle of Catwoman, swearing revenge on the evil tycoon. Schreck encourages Cobblepot to run for mayor, putting him in a position to remove all roadblocks for the businessman's power plant. Together, they stage a kidnapping and rescue, putting the Penguin in the public's favor, and organize a riot by the Red Triangle Gang to discredit the current leader of Gotham. During the raid, Catwoman destroys one of Schreck's businesses, running into Batman in the process. Losing the scuffle with the Dark Knight, Catwoman adds the masked vigilante to her short list of revenge targets. She teams up with Penguin, who attempts to frame Batman for the murder of Gotham's Ice Princess. The Caped Crusader then plays a disparaging recording of Cobblepot speaking ill of the people of Gotham during one of his speeches, forcing him to return to the sewers in shame. There, he hatches a particularly biblical scheme, swearing to kidnap and murder all of the firstborn sons of Gotham, including Max Schreck's adult son, Chip. Max gives himself up in place of his son, following the Penguin back into the sewers under the zoo. There, Batman confronts the Penguin while Catwoman faces Schreck. Bruce reveals his identity in an appeal to Selina's humanity, but she kills Shrek anyway by electrocuting herself and Shrek both. After the dust settles, Batman finds Shrek's remains, but Selina is nowhere to be found. Penguin appears from the murky sewer water but immediately dies due to his sustained injuries. The film ends with Bruce finding a black cat in an alley which he takes home. Just before the credits roll, the bat signal appears in the sky and Catwoman looks up at it, having survived the encounter with Shrek. Like the 1989 film, Batman Returns was a smash hit, breaking box office records and earning Academy Award nominations for visual effects and makeup. The bat symbol was everywhere that summer. Toys, lunchboxes, fast food promotions, and of course, video games. A lot of video games. While Burton's first Batman film only had 3 games based on it for NES, Genesis, and Game Boy, Batman Returns had a whopping 8 tie-ins developed across 2 generations of consoles, including portables and computers. That's not even counting the Tiger Electronic handheld version. First up is the DOS version, developed by Spirit of Discovery. This was their first game, and they only ever went on to make 2 more, a casino game collection called Beat the House, and a licensed sports title called NFL Video Pro Football. This version of the game stands out as it is the only one that is not action-oriented. Instead, it's a point-and-click adventure game similar to LucasArts titles like the Monkey Island series. The only other version of the game for a computer system was an Amiga release developed by Denton Designs. This iteration of the game more closely resembles some of the console releases, presenting itself as a 2D action platformer. Some controversy surrounded this version of the game upon its release, as one of its co-publishers, GameTech, had been sending out screenshots of the DOS adventure game to promote the title. Of course, the game was not, in fact, a port of the DOS title and was furthermore filled with bugs and poor gameplay mechanics. Aspect, developer on some console ports of SNK arcade fighters, handled design duties on the Sega Master System and Game Gear, much like they did with Sega titles such as Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and Sonic Blast. These 2 iterations of the game are virtually identical side-scrolling platformers with action elements. Like some previous Batman titles, the player can throw batarangs to fight enemies and use the grappling hook to traverse obstacles. Malibu Interactive created the Genesis and Sega CD versions, which, like the other 2 Sega versions, are very similar to one another, although the Sega CD release features intermittent driving levels that show off the console's beefier graphical capabilities. Like the Master System and the Game Gear versions, the player can use batarangs and the grappling hook, as well as a variety of other secondary weapons and a gliding function. For the Nintendo Entertainment System, Konami handled the developing and publishing of Batman Returns. This version's main difference from all previously mentioned releases is its 2.5D perspective and Double Dragon-like playstyle. The game also features a couple of side-scrolling vehicle levels that are somewhat reminiscent of the hoverbike section of Battletoads Level 3 for NES. Naturally, some of these iterations on the same film are more successful than others, but for my money, there's only one gem that stands out among the bunch, and that's what we're going to focus on in this episode. Let's take a look at Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The game begins with a stylish take on the Konami logo, setting the tone with snow falling over the iconic bacon strips. The opening cinematic introduces us to the 3 main characters in this story: Penguin, Catwoman, and of course, Batman. The first level, or scene as the title card calls it in a nod to the game's cinematic roots, takes place during the early raid on Gotham by the Red Triangle Gang, where Penguin first takes Max Shrek into the sewers. Here, the player takes control of Batman to clear the streets of the circus-themed villains. The game takes place on a 2.5D playfield and gives the playable character a small moveset and a couple of items by which to take down enemies. The Batarang is useful for stunning enemies or knocking motorcyclists off their vehicles, while a test tube full of mystery chemicals will clear the screen of baddies. But Batman's fists and feet will be the main weapons used throughout this adventure, and they work well enough on their own. Like many stages throughout the game, the first level is split into 2 sections. Following the initial beat-em-up portion, the game changes to a purely 2D side-scrolling playstyle where the Batarang is used as a primary weapon and Batman's grappling hook first becomes available. This portion is more fast-paced than the preceding section and ends with the player reenacting the rescue of Selina Kyle from the clown with the stun gun, initiating the first boss battle of the game. Scene 2 sees Batman continuing to contend with the Red Triangle Gang. The player will battle through the streets as Catwoman's sabotaging of a Shrek department store occurs in the background. Once again, the stage will jump back and forth between 2.5D and 2D action. This level ends with a boss encounter against the tattooed strongman, who Batman dispatches quite easily in the film. The next level has the hero following Catwoman to the rooftops, where he confronts her for her dangerous act of urban destruction. There she will use her whip, her claws, and a rushing attack to fight the Caped Crusader. As in the movie, the cat's loss to the bat has her teaming up with the bird, and the Dark Knight must then try to save the Ice Princess from Cobblepot's clutches. But before Batman's first battle with the Penguin, he must engage in a rematch with Catwoman, after which she takes the Ice Princess to the roof. The following encounter against the Penguin has the villain hovering around with his helicopter umbrella while throwing a combination of flying and exploding projectiles against the player character. The scene ends with the Ice Princess falling off the building, as she does in the film. The following stage presents the player with the one and only driving level in the game, and one that plays out very similarly to the opening stage of the Sega CD version. Using the Batmobile, the player must take down the Penguin's campaign bus, being driven by members of the Red Triangle Gang. Scene 6 sees Batman take down gang members who are kidnapping the firstborn sons of Gotham and locking them in cage cars aboard a train driving through the city streets. The end of this stage has the player go up against the organ grinder, played by character actor Vincent Schiavelli in the film, who has a machine gun hidden in his instrument. The seventh and final stage has the player make their way through the Gotham Zoo, where Cobblepot's army of penguins can be seen with their rockets and mind control devices as they appear in the movie. Here, Batman must take on the Penguin not once, but twice. The first time against his giant duck boat, which fires rockets and attempts to crush the player character. This battle takes place in the 2D playstyle scene in some levels. Upon destroying the duck, Batman finally gets to take on the Penguin once and for all. In this 2.5D encounter, Cobblepot will fire bullets from his umbrella gun, grapple and bite Batman, and occasionally hover around while launching explosives. Upon defeating the Penguin, the player receives a final message about Batman saving the day before the credits roll. The easiest gameplay comparison one can make is to Capcom's Final Fight, which feels remarkably similar mechanically. The controls are intuitive and responsive, and the sound design and hit detection coalesce in a way that makes Batman's every kick and punch feel strong and substantial. The gameplay is at its best during the main beat-em-up sections and suffers a bit in the hectic 2D portions. I understand wanting to break up the monotony of a game, but when the primary gameplay is this strong, you really don't need to. Final Fight doesn't. The biggest drawback to this game compared to Capcom's seminal actioner is its lack of multiplayer. I feel that this is really a restriction of the property on which it's based, as Batman has no Robin in the film. Still, co-op feels integral to this genre of games, so its absence is sorely apparent. Despite some cheap still digitization for the cutscenes, the large in-game sprites allow for a lot of detail. The environments are very nicely rendered, including some parallax effects and foreground elements that give the image depth. One stage even features some primitive dynamic lighting effects, showing sprites darken and lighten as they step into and out of the shadows. For these reasons, I feel that the SNES version of Batman Returns is not only the best playing of these games, but also the best looking, even despite some impressive graphical flourishes in the Sega CD release. Speaking of that version of the game, I'd probably give it the prize for best sound of the bunch. While Danny Elfman's iconic theme sounds really nice rendered with the Super Nintendo sample-based sound chip, the rest of the music in the game is pretty samey, and there's just no competing with the full CD quality of the disc-based platform. Plus, the track from the Bat Ski Boat level is a jam of the highest order. Well, there you have it. Of the 8 releases across consoles, handhelds, and computers, my pick for the cream of the crop goes to Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo. To some, it may seem like nothing more than a single-player clone of Final Fight, but the game's ability to transplant that gameplay so effectively actually makes it one of the best beat-em-ups on the platform. So if you're a fan of the genre or just of Batman in general, I think you owe it to yourself to play one of the best games in the franchise until Rocksteady's Arkham series came along. Until next time, allow me to leave you with my favorite moment from my favorite scene in any Batman movie to date, courtesy of the amazing Michelle Pfeiffer.
I don't know about you, Miss Kitty, but I feel so much yummier.